Time. Hello, welcome. Happy second day of spring, and the weather is certainly helping us out. My name is Pam Cressy. I'm the president of the Alexandria Historical Society. Several of our board members are here. You could kind of raise your hand, board members. Thank you for everything you're doing, and thank you for new membership and anybody who'd like to come. I want to welcome Molly Kerr tonight. Thank you for coming. And she has some very exciting research to present to us, which I think sounds like it could be a lifetime project. You're just at the tip of it. But thankfully, she's in Alexandria, which I think will make a big difference to everything we know about this town, expanding our understanding, as there always are new ways of doing history. I'd also like to introduce Sarah McBurney, who is on the camera back here. Yay, Sarah. And Sarah's with the Alexandria City High School. And we are partnering with the broadcast club there to be taping our sessions. And you will find Molly's talk on our YouTube station in maybe 6 to 8 weeks. Sarah, it doesn't take Sarah that long to produce it, by the way, but we thought we do want people to come and join us and not just sit home and watch it on TV or on their phones as well. Hey, hi. So let me just tell you, the broadcast club is composed of their teacher, Vilma Sefrin, who is a force unto herself, of the finest and most talented team of TV media students. So we're glad to have you here, Sarah. Thank you. Molly is the founding director of History Revealed, as you can see up here, Inc. And she comes with a background, academic studies, in both anthropology at Mary Washington and also archaeology at really the seat of public archaeology, the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville. And the first book on public archaeology was called Public Archaeology by Bob McGimsey. And I think he really pioneered the approach of working with people and looking at history and archaeology for why it has a wider value than just things in the ground, but much broader, and doing planning. She has a wide range of experience, and she was not only doing archaeology, but she was teaching teachers. And we have Gwen here, who was a teacher of history, and she also created a database cataloging enslaved people at Mount Vernon, or everywhere. I guess George Washington had certain properties. And she's focused on store accounts, and maybe you'll tell us a little bit about why that's the case. And as we all know as consumers, advertising people are always studying us, right? Like, I was horrified to find when I bought a car a few years ago, and it took me months of research, Consumer Reports, months of research, that in fact I was the exact demographic that particular company expected to buy their car. So if I just looked up who I'm supposed to be and what I should do, then I could just go out and buy that stuff. They didn't have that problem back then, but I think there was some advertising. I think I saw some newspaper accounts noting some adjectives for things coming in, and bulbs, tulips and things like that coming for spring. So we do know that advertising was a key feature going all the way back. But she's looking at what these 18th century records tell us about the people, places, and events, and of course the material culture of not only Alexandria, but also Colchester. And I live on Mason Neck. Colchester vied with Alexandria at that time, both tobacco ports on the Occoquan. And if you drive south on Route 1 or on 95, when you cross the Occoquan, which is just where the traffic hits, so you actually sit on top of the Occoquan for a long time. Old Colchester is just on the Virginia side, on the east, and virtually unknown today by many people. So Molly's going to discuss what can be revealed about the community in and around 18th century Alexandria from the ledgers. The account books detail a wealth of information from a community, describing people and places, objects, economies, politics, religion, events. They are different from the typical prose of a letter or diary and reveal insights into the lives of less recognized members of the community, like women and the enslaved, through their own accounts as well as the purchases they made, and interestingly enough, on those made on their behalf by others. Using ledgers, Sarah and her group is going to be working on the Shopping Stories project, which hopes to develop a prosopography. Prosopography, which has a study that identifies and relates a group of persons or characters within a particular historical or literary context. So we're going to take things and put them together with the people and see what it means, even if we can't pronounce the word. The current project focuses on the Alexandria community and its consumer habits right before the Revolution and beyond, using the ledgers from 1770 to 1802. And that is really such a fascinating time, right before, during, and after the Revolution, when Alexandria is going through so much change. And they belong to Robert Townsend Hoe. I was taught to say the word Hoe. In Fairfax County, they say Hooey. Anyhow, H-O-O-E, and his associates, as well as the personal ledger of John Mills, who was at Shooter's Hill and where Alexandria Archaeology has excavated for many years. She has worked on crowdsourcing, transcribing platform called From the Page, where volunteers record the data from the ledgers and journals in a template and assist in reviews of previous transcriptions. Her work has been funded by our own local Historic Alexandria Foundation. We have one or several members representing us. Yeah, Gail, yeah, right. And as well as the Omohundro Foundation, or Institute. And her ledgers from this initial phase focused on the accounts of John Glassford and Company. And this is all going to be published online for us to be able to read. So thanks, Molly. Welcome.
Well, let me start by saying thank you to everybody for coming out this evening. As I understand, this is one of the first post-COVID in-person presentations for the Society, so I'm kind of excited and honored to get to be the person who leads off. And I also just want to say that I forgot all the things that I put in the introduction. So I'm going to apologize if there's a little redundancy as I get started here. But you'll get to hear it all again with a slide, maybe. All right, so ledgers represent, as was kind of already alluded to, a major untapped resource of Alexandria's history, especially from its pre-revolutionary years when not very much is known, as there are very few sources, and the newspaper advertisements don't really start until 1784. So you've got this long gap where there isn't a whole lot known about Alexandria's early founding. And because of the nature of store ledgers, they capture the daily lives of both the rich and the poor who purchased on credit, and that provides a small window into the lives of those who are historically underrepresented. Tonight, I want to share with you my enthusiasm for ledgers or store accounts or account books. I kind of use all of that interchangeably throughout, and what can be learned from them. And as Pam has already alluded, this is likely a long time project. Because there is a lot to learn and there are a lot of ledgers out there to work through. And I do want to say just up front, because I know that I am presenting in front of a group of people who love Alexandria's history. I hope that you learn from me tonight, and I hope that I have a chance to learn from you, because I anticipate that you all may have a lot of knowledge that I don't, because I'm dealing with one very small data set. And so I am hoping that you all will be able to help me and shed some light on some of the things that maybe I don't know or maybe I get wrong. And I look forward to answering those questions or hearing your thoughts at the end. So the Shopping Stories project began as a crowdsourced transcription partnership between George Washington's Mount Vernon and the Fairfax County Park Authority in 2011, thereabouts. City archaeologist Dr. Eleanor Breen was a Mount Vernon Archaeological Research Fellow at the time and was studying George Washington's consumer habits.
We're getting closer.
Okay. Oh, there we go. George Washington's consumer habits by looking at his orders and invoices with London. Dr. Breen was interested in comparing Washington's consignment purchases against the local direct sales taking place in towns close to Mount Vernon, like Colchester and Alexandria. About the same time, the Fairfax County Park Authority launched its archaeological project focused on newly acquired county lands that encompass part of the now defunct town of Colchester, and ledgers from the Library of Congress for the John Glassford and Company stores in Colchester and Alexandria for 1758 to 69 provided access to information for their respective projects. With over 4,000 crowdsourced transcripts created by over 300 volunteers all across the country, History Revealed, my organization, took over to shift it from a transcription project to one looking at ways to analyze the transcripts and make them more accessible to researchers. Which brings us to today, and while we really love editing transcripts and doing all the research, we knew that there were other ledgers that provided connections to Alexandria. And so over the last several years, we've applied for grants from the Omohundro Institute and the Historic Alexandria Foundation, basically to sponsor the digitization of an additional 10 ledgers, journals, and invoice books from the Alexandria stores associated with Robert Townsend Hoe. And so that was going to be one of my questions for you all. If anybody else has, is it Who? Is it Hoe? Is it Hooey? It's spelled H-O-O-E. And so one of the things that's fascinating to me is being able to pick up on the language and the dialect, because there was no Webster's Dictionary at that point, so there was no standardized spelling. So what's fun about the ledgers is that you can pick up the how people said things by how they spelled them. And you can see the same thing spelled 3 different ways by 3 different authors on the same page. And so those are the kinds of things that make it a little bit more, because you can start to hear it. You can hear the language.
Is that microphone working?
As far as I know, it is. Yes, ma'am. So, and so these new ledgers run from 1770 to 1802, as well as that personal ledger by John Mills. All of these new ledgers that we've been working with are found at the New York Public Library, and as part of what they did on my behalf and on History Revealed's behalf for digitization, they're also made publicly available on the New York Public Library's digital collections. So if you ever wanted to go look at them and you didn't want to worry about what History Revealed was up to, New York Public Library now has them also as part of their digital collections. And not to dissuade you from going to special collections here at Alexandria as well, where you can also see them on microfilm. So we have begun the transcription process for these ledgers. And so that basically extends our shopping dates from 1758 with the original Colchester ledger all the way up to 1802 with the Alexandria store ledgers. And so our hope ultimately is to be able to compare those consumer habits from well before the Revolution and all the way up through the founding and the New Republic. So as promised, maybe. There we go. Whoops. Too soon. Okay, as promised, in case you are not familiar with where the stores are, Colchester no longer exists. And it was basically the only thing that still resides, so there's your traffic jam right there. The only thing that still resides there today is one 18th century building, which was a tavern at the time. It's now a private residence that Fairfax County Park Authority recently acquired. So they are going to be adding it to their park that is there. And of course, as we know, Alexandria survived. Lots of ups and downs, but it is now obviously successful and thriving and bustling. Maybe. All right, so if we go back to finding the sweet spot of where to hold the, there we go, okay. So Colchester was founded in 1753. It was platted on 25 acres that belonged to Peter Wagner. It was approximately 42 1/2-acre lots with 3 primary streets 60 feet wide. Today the road is like 22 feet wide. So it's a big difference in terms of what it would have looked like in the 18th century. Alexandria, as you probably are aware, was founded 4 years earlier, nearly double the size of Colchester, and belonged to lands of John and Philip Alexander and Hugh West, and it contained double the number of lots at 84 1/2-acre lots. So we know the Colchester store in all likelihood was on what was known as lot number 3, at least at its founding. It may have later moved, but we definitely know that that was where it was, and was rented from, the land was rented from Benjamin Grayson. And we assume that that was the place because that Benjamin Grayson's lot also had what was described as a storehouse and a stable. So it was the most ideal situated place. In contrast, the Alexandria store that belonged to John Glassford and Company was here on lot number 31, so at Fairfax and Queen Streets. And then the Hoe store, at least in its origins, was here at King and Fairfax, and was rented from the widow Susanna Patterson. So all 3 of these stores are documented in the ledgers, not just in terms of their overhead expenses, but also in material that was purchased to modify, to change, and to add to the existing buildings, as well as all the services rendered. The people who did the work is often documented as well. All right, so how do ledgers work? So, cursive handwriting, challenging in and of itself. Then we also add bookkeeping. If anybody has ever used QuickBooks, Quicken, Mint, any of the online softwares that help you balance your checkbooks, this is, in essence, the 18th century version of that in book form instead of computerized form. It shows a credit economy, not a barter economy. So all goods and services have specific value, and all of them have something that is exchanged. And that is what's good about the ledgers, is they can tell you exactly what the exchange was. They keep track of the store's expenses and income over a certain time period, and they are the legal document that is created for at the end of the fiscal year. This is, if I'm the store owner and you owe me money, then this is what I'm going to take to the courts with me. So this is a very important record, and there are even court cases where store owners are trying to collect their debts or are trying to hide from their debts, and the books disappear. So it's amazing that we have these ledgers that are extant today. Why they are at the John Glassford and Company are at the Library of Congress, have been there since like 1898. The Hoe ledgers have been at New York Public Library since the 1930s. Why they saved them, I don't know, other than to say I'm really thankful that they did, because it's got all kinds of fun stuff in it. So the ledger pages are broken down into 2 halves. So typically, often the left-hand side and the right-hand side. We see them often when you don't see the book itself. You see the photographs, and they're separated. And so sometimes it's really hard to keep track of the fact that you've got the name for the account spread across 2 pages. So we have the debit page, which details all the purchases. We have the payment page, or the credit page, the credit page, which details all the payments. And rarely do the dates line up. Just like today. Anybody pay their credit card bill the same day they make a purchase? So it's the same thing that's happening then. And so at the same time, so we have this. This is the end of the year. This is the ledger, the store account, the account book. At the end of every day, there is someone who is keeping a day book. And in essence, we can recreate, using the day books or the journals, the actual events of the day, who came into the store, the order in which they came into the store. And those day books also provide us a lot of information that isn't included in the final ledger. So I don't know if you can read this. 2 cash paid sundries per journal. Per journal, very boring. We hate when it says per journal. It doesn't tell us anything. Sundries tells us even less. When we have the journal, we can go back and see what those sundries were. We can see who the shopper was who came into the store, because it often is not the account holder.
This is Virginia currency and sterling. What are they paying in?
So in this particular series, they're paying in Virginia currency and sterling. So this is from 1770 to 73 from the Hostone and Company ledger. So in this particular instance, they move in both currencies all the time. And each year the exchange rate is slightly different. So it's British sterling or Virginia currency. And so this often is like today, funny money in the cloud. You slap your credit card down, the money just kind of moves magically between the bank. The same thing is happening here in these books. There's rarely any hard currency in motion, so everything is moving kind of in this credit cloud-like way. And so in this particular instance, none of these transactions occurred in sterling, British sterling. They only transacted in Virginia currency. And the rate is usually somewhere around 1/3 to 1/2 more. So if it's 5 shillings British sterling, it's going to be 10 shillings Virginia currency. And it fluctuates from year to year, so they have Virginia almanacs. They're great resources because they often keep that price the same throughout the whole year. So unlike here today when it fluctuates day to day, where you have to go online and figure out when are you going to buy that before you go overseas, it pretty much started at the beginning of the year, the rate, and that was the rate for the whole year. All right, so at present, we have started transcribing again. So we have 2 different phases of the project going on right now. We have the research and editing phase, and we have the transcribing phase. And we would love your help with the transcribing phase. The Historic Alexandria Foundation grants are helping fund our ability to put everything up on this platform called From the Page. It's a crowdsourced platform, and we currently have 5 of the Hoe-related ledgers and journals available to transcribe, as well as John Mills's ledger is also up there and available for transcribing. So if you want to dip your keyboard into exploring them specifically and translating them into a form that we can use later, we would love to have your help. And in fact, we're hoping to launch in the summer. Emma's sitting over here and I'm looking at her. We are hoping to start transcribing days with Alexandria Archaeology come late spring, early summer to get started. So you will be able to come and work with me and with a team of folks to do transcribing in person if you're not confident enough to sit in your lounger at home in your keyboard and watch HDTV and do it at home at 2 o'clock in the morning. So I encourage you to keep an ear out for when those opportunities present themselves. All right, so what does the transcribing the ledger entail? Anybody afraid yet? So as accounting documents, we want them to kind of resemble accounting documents in their transcript form. So we are using From the Page as our online crowdsourced endeavor. And so you can see how the challenge is from changing basically this handwriting into this format. And so some of the things that we definitely do are we repeat things over and over and over again, because otherwise that gets lost. Because of the way spreadsheets work, if you don't keep repeating it, then you lose it. So that basically, to William Hepburn's credit, paid Samuel Fielder's man Isaac. If you don't keep that connected to the seat at Shooter's Hill and with the date, that gets lost. And so you wouldn't know that it was at the seat of Shooter's Hill. So we want to try to kind of keep that, keep those smallest possible pieces together so that we can ultimately compare apples to apples. And so while all of the books don't have the same format, which can be very challenging, we have tried to create a template to do that. So can everybody, how are we doing with reading the cursive handwriting? It does. So one of the challenges with doing it is learning. It's a lot like a puzzle. It's a lot like learning a foreign language. The handwriting, if you have any cursive handwriting background, it's still the same cursive that we use today. The letters are just a little different and the slant of the pen is just a little different. But once you start reading it, it's often, you start to see it. And one of the things that we have elected to do as an organization that a lot of times transcriptions don't do, we've decided we want to make them immediately usable. We don't just do WM, because 3 years from now, we might not remember what WM stands for. We know right now it stands for William, so we go ahead and transcribe it in square brackets afterwards. And that means you, as a new transcriber, when you come in, it gives you the ability to go back and look at other pages and compare. What did that letter look like? What did somebody see before? And so it gives you the ability basically to compare the letters and then put them in down here. And so that's part of what we hope for. What's interesting about this particular version, so this is John Mills's ledger. So this is literally Shooter's Hill. This is one of the pages having to do, that's connected to the archaeological project that's ongoing nearly every summer, I think. They actually talk about how the house is constructed, what materials were provided, who brought them to the site, who was engaged in the construction. But what also is interesting about this is the handwriting of this particular ledger is someone who clearly, who probably did not grow up here. They did not learn how to write here, and if they did, they learned from someone who was from the early 18th century, because their handwriting is distinctly different from what we see in all the other ledgers. Their abbreviations are slightly different, and so I actually was just looking at something today that came out of Scotland, which talks about how to read Scottish documents from 1500 to 1700, and I was like, oh, that handwriting looks very familiar. So, you know, it's where you can start to see some of those overlaps. But to ease your mind, we have put the instructions are on every page. There is a detailed glossary. There's a very detailed transcribing manual, and you are welcome to ask as many questions as you go as you want. We are very open to questions, and there's plenty of places where you can ask those questions as well. So that's one of the things that we want you to participate. We recognize that it is challenging, especially if it's not something that you've ever done before. So, what are we going to do with all those transcripts? Transcripts by themselves are often remain inaccessible. They're just sheets of paper. How do you deal with that? How do you compare? Because a lot of the questions that we want to ask the ledgers involve multiple pages, multiple books. How do you see all of that at once? That goes back to the reason why we transcribe by putting in the, inserting what does the ditto mean. Does everybody know what ditto means? So see above, see before, see also. We want you to know what the ditto means when we do the transcribing, so that that doesn't get lost. And so when you want to look at lots of things, dittos quickly become very confusing if you don't have the definition. So we want to understand the types of questions that might be asked. So we've been asking ourselves and others for the last 10 plus years, what kinds of questions do you want to ask the ledgers, so that we can do our best to make sure as we create a database that we can find the answers to those questions. So if you're a genealogist and you want to focus on account holders, and you want to learn more about the account holders and the shoppers, you want to be able to type that person's name in and see what comes out. If you are an archaeologist, you may be in search of a particular object because you want to know who purchased it, how many were purchased, how much it cost, because you found one in the ground during an excavation. If you're a museum curator, you are researching a particular house and you want to be able to put that house back together, so you want to know what was purchased to go into that house. So we wanted to be able to create something that researchers at all levels will be able to gain access to. And so we want to be able to focus not just on the names, we want to be able to focus on the people, we want to be able to focus on the dates, we want to be able to focus on the objects. So once the transcripts are completed and edited, of which we pretty much have the Colchester 1760 to 61 ledger completed and edited, what happens next is what I imagine many of you who were quite panicked about transcribing will be able to do, which is dig into our database. So with the Glassford ledgers in the editing phase, and the Hoe ledger still being transcribed, we have begun investigating ways to digitally publish over 9,500 pages, is what we estimate it's going to be, from the 22 ledgers, journals, and invoice books. How do you publish that and have it make sense so that you can query lots of things? So we've been working with teams from the computer science department at the University of Central Florida. They have a senior design class that students put their very young brains around trying to figure out how do we translate those 9,500 spreadsheets into a database that anybody can use on the internet. And so we think we are almost ready to go live in the next month, at least with the first draft of what that database looks like. It does, in fact, live on the internet right now. It's not very sexy. So I would encourage you to hold off maybe another month and then go to shoppingstories.org and see what we're doing. But one of our plans is, in essence, to be able to, so that you can see the relationships between things, as well as being able to see the results of when a search has happened, what you have searched on. So that is what our goal is with the project. So that is the hard part of tonight's presentation. So thank you for staying awake so far, because now we're going to talk about why is doing all of this exciting, because that is, I'm sure, what most of you all came to see. But I feel it's important, and as you can tell from my enthusiasm over it, that you need the background in order to see why what I'm getting ready to tell you is so challenging and so exciting to see the final results of. So what happens when you start taking a deep dive into the data? So names. We'll start with names. So when we think of people of the past, the first that usually come to mind are the famous ones, the ones found in our history books: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln. And while we are certainly getting better at thinking more broadly, most folks don't immediately jump to women or people of color in terms of the names that they think of. And in the world of primary sources, the same is definitely true. Many of the surviving documents were written by rich white men for rich white men. But how do you take those documents and find everybody else? Because a lot of times they are there. You just have to look again. So if we take a second look, we often can find the evidence of the everyday lives of everyday people, not found in the history books. And this is where my favorite document, the ledger, plays a really critical role. So if you are an African American attempting to get past the wall, the census of 1870, a lot of times you are limited by the documents of property records, wills, and inventories. But ledgers have lots of names in them and are an untapped resource for identifying both free and enslaved African Americans, as well as women and the poor, in a world of elite white male-dominated documents. Ledgers open a window into an entire community of individuals if we stop to take a look. Given that account books generally contain indexes, although some are incomplete or missing, we have sat down and gone page by page through each ledger to document all the account holders, all the people, the places, the organizations, and the store-related accounts contained throughout. This master list enables us to better identify those individuals, regardless of name spelling variations. Remember, there is no Webster's. And track them from 1758 to 1769 across ledgers in both Alexandria and Colchester. While some duplication undoubtedly still exists, we made a concerted effort to distinguish, for example, one Henry Bogues from another as he appeared in each ledger. At the moment, we have narrowed it down to 4 different Henrys, in case you were wondering, and our current names index catalogs the account holders found in the John Glassford and Company stores, but we hope to merge the list with the new additions from the Robert Townsend Hoe ledgers here soon. And this particular index is available on our website. So if you wanted to see who these 5,901 account holders were, you can go and take a look. So, while the initial focus has been on those who have accounts, we've also begun to identify all those individuals who made purchases in the 1760 to 61 Colchester ledger, those without accounts, and we have identified an additional 180 people. So that gives us a strong probability of a community of shoppers of well over 600 free and enslaved men and women at this one store in 1 year. And by contrast, we've identified an additional 257 names without accounts in the Hostone and Company ledger from 70 to 73, giving us nearly 500 shoppers in Alexandria. So in case you haven't gathered, we have started working and have gotten complete but are just starting to edit the Host-Owned and Company 70 to 73 ledger. And so we hope to be able to do a compare and contrast between these two stores, kind of a decade apart. So what happens if we start focusing on just those who are enslaved? In combing through the John Glassford and Company ledgers, we found 6 enslaved men and women with their own store accounts, independent of their enslaver. 4 men, Davy, Will, and Jack, and 2 women, Sue and Rachel. In the Alexandria-based Host-Owned and Company ledger, we only find 1 man, Syphax, and in the later Hoe and Harrison ledgers, 1786 to 89, a Jack Robinson. We are still working out whether Syphax and Jack Robinson were enslaved, so please be sure to let us know what you know. Just like everyone else in the ledgers, these enslaved men and women made purchases on credit, paid their accounts, navigated the local economy with apparent autonomy. Purchases were practical as well as frivolous, but their payments were generally made in either ready money or services rendered to the stores or others. But these names only represent individuals with store accounts. What about everyone else found within accounts that represent purchases made by them or on behalf of them? In the Colchester 60 to 61 ledger, we find upwards of 29 individuals who were clearly enslaved, or possibly so, as only a first name was included. Celia, Glasgow, and Milford were enslaved by the Colchester store. Betty was hired out to the store from Bertrand Ewell. Kate was a washerwoman enslaved by Elizabeth Fallon, who frequently washed the store's linens. And we have more to learn about Great Jack, Peter, Will, Billy, Prince, and Adam, plus several others described simply as Negro boy, Negro girl, or by their enslaver, such as Mr. McCrae's boy. By contrast, in Alexandria 10 years later, nearly all the enslaved found in the ledgers have names and associated enslavers. We know Anthony and Ben were hired by the store from Robert Townsend Hoe, and that Peter was hired by the store from William Ramsey, while Jack came over from Port Tobacco and may have been enslaved by Robert Hanson Harrison or the Port Tobacco store, still to be determined. George was enslaved by Elizabeth Hunter, was also hired out to the store and to the schooner John. In addition to George, the schooner John also hired Watt from Robert Hanson Harrison. 2 unnamed men were enslaved by local doctors, William Rumney and William Brown, and both of the gentlemen had leather breeches purchased for them. And in September 1771, Robert Adam and Company paid £2 5 shillings for passage of an unnamed enslaved man from Barbados on the schooner John to Alexandria. An interesting contrast between the Colchester and Alexandria stores is the lack of enslaved women identified in the later Alexandria ledger. So does this mean enslaved women weren't to be found in the burgeoning town? Probably not. We just simply need to look for other ways to find them. So, as I have alluded already, a way we can learn more about the daily lives of the enslaved is through evidence of hiring out, which may have been the more common fate of many individuals enslaved by residents within the town of Alexandria, like the previously described Anthony, Ben, Peter, George, and Watt. Although we also find it in Colchester with Betty and Kate being hired out to the store as well. Hiring out was the practice of renting your enslaved man or woman to another for a designated period of time. As the enslaver, you would profit from the arrangement and not be responsible for tithes or taxes associated with the individual during that time. Usually, evidence of the practice is limited to occasional receipts found in individuals' private papers or later newspaper advertisements, either advertising availability of or seeking enslaved individuals with specific skills. What makes evidence of hiring out in the ledgers unique is we can sometimes learn exactly what those individuals were doing when they were hired out. For example, in late February 1772, we find that at least 2 individuals were hired by the store from William Ramsey and Elizabeth Hunter to bail out the store's cellar. Anybody have a cellar in Alexandria that floods? Courtesy of George Washington's weather journals, we know that at the beginning of February, heavy snows occurred that took most of the month to melt. And by February 20th, although nearly melted away, they had several days of very heavy rains and brisk northwest winds. So between those snows and heavy rains, all of a sudden drainage around town proved challenging and required the store to seek help for bailing out their cellar on February 21st, 22nd, and 25th. They needed some help to remove clearly the water that had flowed into their cellar as a result of the melting snow and rain. And what I find particularly interesting about the second entry is to cash pay Mr. Ramsey's Daniel for helping to bail the cellar. So in this instance, Daniel was paid directly for his services. This wasn't paid to William Ramsey. This was paid to Daniel directly. So he now has ready money, or at least credit with the store to spend at a later date. So sometimes we have to read between the lines to learn about the unnamed enslaved individuals in the account books. If we exclude the ready money accounts that simply document an immediate purchase and payment and focus on the named accounts, how might we begin to identify purchases made on behalf of the enslaved? The Colchester account of Richard Wilson provides us a peek into these kinds of purchases made from 1760 to 61. Wilson paid for his own purchases by selling the store a pair of shoes valued at 5 shillings. The shoes were specifically described as being for Celia, a girl enslaved by the store. A week later, he provided an additional pair of shoes for one of the enslaved boys or men. In the previous ledger, Wilson sold pairs of shoes for Alan and Betty on behalf of the store. In all, 7 pairs of shoes were purchased by the store as provisions for its enslaved that year. 5 pairs for men ranged in price from 3 to 5 shillings 6 pence. 2 pairs for women ranged in price from 2 shillings 4 pence to 5 shillings. These ranges were consistent with the prices of over 40% of the shoes sold to all the customers that year, meaning the designation of for whom they were purchased, or without the designation of for whom they were purchased, shoes don't represent a great object to use to discover enslavement. However, the 7 pairs of shoes do provide us a small glimpse into who the enslaved associated with the store were. The shoes were purchased for Celia, Betty, Glasgow, and Milford as part of their annual provisions. Using the ledgers, we know Glasgow was purchased from Benjamin Grayson in July 1759. Celia's purchase date has yet to be determined. Celia's and Glasgow's ages were adjudged to be 10 years old by the sheriff, who was provided 19 pounds tobacco for recording it in the court order book on November 20th, 1759. Celia was provided 2 shifts, petticoats, and jackets in March of 1761, and in November had a jacket and petticoat made in green baize, a coarse fabric with worsted, warp, and woolen weft. Say that 3 times fast. With a plain weave commonly used to line clothing or the backs of cabinets, not as outerwear. So its vibrant color makes us wonder, did she select the fabric or did her enslaver? At the same time, she also had a handkerchief, shift, and apron made. The next time we find Celia in the ledgers is in November 1764, when she and her child, she would have only been about 15 years old at that point, were sold to James Cleveland, who was most likely George Washington's overseer, James Cleveland, at River Farm for 90 pounds. So it is possible that Celia went from Colchester to what we know today of as River Farm to live. By contrast to shoes, an object that definitely opens the door to identifying enslavement in the ledgers was the hoe. Yet it was never overtly associated with them in its purchase. In Alexandria, we find only 2 purchases of hoes in the Hoe, Stone and Company ledger, which isn't unexpected given the more urban environment of the town and the shift in agricultural practices away from tobacco to wheat and by extension flour by that time. The store moved just over 1,100 pounds Virginia currency in tobacco during the 3-year period, but nearly 3,400 pounds Virginia currency in wheat and well over 7,000 in flour. It also dealt in bags, herrings, stave, flax, and corn. By comparison, Colchester, for the single year of 1760 to 61, the primary payment of accounts was in tobacco, in which the store exchanged nearly 2,300 pounds Virginia currency and a comparable amount in British sterling based on the nearly 224,000 pounds of tobacco shipped to Glasgow in 1761. As expected of a store servicing a more rural location, the store's manager, Alexander Henderson, ordered from Glasgow in 1759 and in 1760 a combined 450 hoes to be made available for sale. While primarily noted as broad, he also ordered narrow hoes, and based on their wholesale prices, they came in several gauges, and all requested with strong or welded eyes. Of those ordered, Henderson sold 96, described as broad, narrow, hilling, grubbing, and weeding. And those additional nomenclature is probably a direct result of the gauges of the hoes. Each hoe retailed for between 3 shillings and 4 shillings 9 pence. Samuel Canterbury purchased 6 of those narrow hoes on February 20th, 1761. While no mention of the enslaved can be found in his accounts, he also purchased a large broadaxe, a 7 feet long steel crosscut saw, and associated file for sharpening it, and thousands of nails, all of which would be needed for constructing buildings, often the labor of the enslaved. He also purchased 7 gallons of rum in late July, which can be indicative of incentives provided to the enslaved during times of harvest. But did Canterbury enslave anyone? For that, we do have to turn to outside sources. According to Beth Mitchell's interpretive map of Fairfax County 1760, we can confirm that Samuel Canterbury owned 170 acres adjacent to present-day Burke and enslaved 10 individuals. So we have that right there. And if you're familiar at all with the map, the 10 basically points to the number of enslaved. And we know from the Fairfax County Historic Courthouse records, Canterbury died conveniently in 1764, leaving 13 enslaved men and women to his wife Mary and niece Mary Ann. In Canterbury's will, he specifically left enslaved Eleanor to his wife Mary, and the remainder of his estate was divided 1/3 to his niece and the remaining 2/3 to his wife. Mary Ann Hill inherited Sampson, Sal, and Hagar. Mary Cleveland, who by the time of the settlement of Canterbury's estate had remarried Eli Cleveland, the brother of James, who purchased Celia from the Colchester store, inherited Cato, Sue, James, Sarah, Peter, Millie, Di, Harry, and an unnamed child who was born after Canterbury's death, for a total valuation in human capital at 241 pounds. Hoes would have been sold by the store handleless, so it made it the responsibility of the enslaved to fashion them to their personal preferences and for the task at hand. So the hoes purchased by Canterbury in February would have been put to work almost immediately, planting the 5 hogsheads of tobacco exchanged for 43 pounds Virginia currency in payment of Canterbury's account in July and August of that year. What did that planting entail? When the hoes were purchased, the tobacco seedlings would have been growing in small beds protected from the weather. A couple of weeks later, those seedlings would be transplanted to small hills raised by those hoes through the labor of the enslaved. In 1774, while visiting Nanjemoy in Maryland, Nicholas Creswell, whose journal also details his visit here in Alexandria, describes seeing 2 enslaved individuals plant 3 acres of tobacco plants in about 4,000 hills per acre in one day. Although Colonial Williamsburg's historic farmer, Ed Schultz, expects it to be more like 3,000 to 6,000 transplanted per person per day. From practical experience, Schultz knows it takes between 10 to 14 strokes of the hoe to raise a hill about 18 inches wide and near a foot tall. Imagine being responsible for the creation of 2,000 hills every day for weeks on end. How tired might you be? And assuming all 170 acres of Canterbury's land was under cultivation, that would amount to over 500,000 hills of tobacco plants to be created, planted, and managed over the growing season with those narrow hoes purchased at the Colchester store in February 1761. Their purchase amounts to our ability to have a much larger exploration into what the lives of the enslaved would have been like for those responsible for growing and tending tobacco in Virginia. So, in my final example this evening, we turn to purchases made directly by the enslaved themselves. One of the interesting stories to come out of the ledgers has been the ability to learn more about the enslaved community and its connections within the larger community, especially through the accounts of enslaved individuals. Jack represents a case study of the enslaved experience in Colchester. Jack maintained an account with the Colchester store through every extant ledger. Based on the account header, we know he was enslaved by the estate of Mr. Linton. A search of local probate inventories provides a clue to who Linton may have been. Moses Linton died in 1752, 7 years prior to Jack's appearance at the Colchester store. At his death, Linton enslaved 18 individuals. With Jack's value at only 17 pounds, we assume he was fairly young at Linton's death, but regardless of his age, by 1759, he was acting as an independent carpenter with the freedom to hire himself out and shop in Colchester, over 13 miles away from his presumed home. So this basically is the border at that time between Loudoun County and Fairfax County. And I don't know if you remember where Colchester was, but it's way down here. To help pay for his purchases, Jack made furniture for the store. He sold to the store eggs and ducks. He worked for at least 11 different people who provided him credit toward his account, including the construction of at least 2 coffins. In 1768, we even find evidence of Jack hiring himself and his son to Alexander Henderson for over 6 months, which provided Jack 29 pounds, 5 shillings of credit at the store. And in case you were wondering, that's about the same amount that an average journeyman tradesman would make in a year at this same time period. Over 10 plus years, Jack made 216 purchase transactions at the store. 44 of those were made by or on behalf of others, both enslavers and enslaved. An item Jack repeatedly purchased was rum, including purchases of it for enslaved Will, Joe, Tom, Milford, and Harrison. He even paid the store debt of joiner John Monroe, who enslaved Will. The ledgers provide 3 additional hints of Jack's personal agency: the rental of his horse, primers, and shot, powder, and gunflints. In 1764, Jack was paid 10 shillings for the use of his horse. Whether this horse belonged to Jack or not is irrelevant, as he was the one who was paid by the store for its use. Like today, horse ownership was limited to those with access to the resources to provide for it. The only purchase Jack made to imply he was responsible for the care of an animal was leading lines. No other tack was purchased. And although having access to a horse is inferred through credits for running errands and moving goods on behalf of the store and others in the community, we don't know if Jack was provided the horse as part of Linton's estate, or did he own it outright. The likely answer is that he did in fact own it, only because the store would have provided the credit for the horse to Linton's estate, not directly to Jack. In 1766, Jack purchased 2 primers, which implies either he or someone in his household was reading or learning to read. Contemplating Jack's literacy poses more questions than answers, but shows his pursuance of an ability that many of his white neighbors had. Aside from his purchase of these books, we will be unlikely to learn anything more about Jack's ability to read or write, but we are ever optimistic. The final item purchased of interest is shot, gunpowder, and gunflints. As of 1748, Virginia law forbid enslaved individuals from owning or possessing firearms, with a punishment of up to 39 lashes and the weapon seizure. Yet here was Jack repeatedly making purchases connected to firearms: 8 purchases of shot and gunpowder and 2 purchases of gunflints. Henderson would be well aware of the law, yet sold these items to Jack anyway. It is likely Jack used the shot and gunpowder for hunting to supplement his family's diet, or to sell, like the ducks sold to the store, but as he also purchased from the store sugar, molasses, pork, including a whole hog, beef, including a calf, salt, and corn. So, as you have hopefully gathered, the ledgers reveal a myriad of ways goods tell the story of the communities in Colchester and Alexandria, as well as more about the store's customers. They show that nearly everything imaginable was made available for sale, from yards of fabric to building supplies to medicines, spices, alcohol, and even human beings like Celia. In addition, the ledgers reveal much about the operation of the store, from wages earned, rent paid, food acquired for consumption, and hints at the daily lives of the enslaved belonging to the stores as well as its customers. For historically excluded communities, the ledgers have much more to tell us about individuals like Jack and their connections, as well as how the status of enslavement was understood by the Colchester and Alexandria communities. As we continue to move the transcripts into a digital format, we look forward to learning more from these ledgers about the tumultuous decades of great political change in the Virginia colony, from a war with France to the founding of a new nation. So lastly this evening, since as you can gather we've wrapped up here, I want to thank the Historic Alexandria Foundation for its continued support of this project, and especially to you all, the Alexandria Historical Society, for giving me an opportunity this evening to share a few of the interesting discoveries we've been able to make by looking at ledgers through the Shopping Stories Project. So thank you all very much. Questions? Yes, sir.
What do you plan to do within the platform to give meaning to the currency amounts that are listed?
Okay, so the question is, what are we going to do to give currency value to currency? And I presume you mean comparison to modern?
Or something, a labor unit?
Okay, so I am of the school from Colonial Williamsburg, in which you never try to translate the inflation, basically. It's too many steps have passed from the 18th century to today to be able to say this value is equal to today's money. But what I can say, and what I hope that we're going to be able to do, is create contextual essays that basically complement what's in there, where we can say a horse was valued at this price then, a horse is valued at this price today. So if a horse is valued at 50 pounds in the 18th century, what does that equate to a horse? I don't know, anybody know what the going rate is for a good horse? That kind of thing, where I want to try to kind of find what is a comparable rate. And that is something that I hope to be able to do, is basically come up with some key items and illustrate how those work. I usually use the horse example, but it's probably not the fairest, simply because not everyone had a horse.
Would you consider using wages?
We certainly could use wages. As I alluded, Jack, in a 6-month span, by hiring himself and his son out, made basically the equivalent of what a journeyman tradesman was making at the same time. We can certainly compare it to the wages that the store keep. So the store manager and his assistants, their wages are all very clearly defined every year. You can see them getting paid. But I'm not sure how we would exactly equate that to today, because your time and service would be a lot more then than it is today. Yes, sir.
I presume from your remarks that at that time, banks did not exist. Is that correct? And if not, when did they emerge?
All right, so the question is, did banks exist at this time, and when did they emerge? So I'm going to try the second one first. And so that's, banks as we understand them is post-revolution, start of founding new nation, late 1780s, early 1790s. So these stores act like banks for all intent and purposes. So that you can pay your taxes through the stores. You can pay your neighbors through the stores. You can hire people out through the stores. And basically all that money lives up here. It lives in the books. It never is seen, but everything has value. And so everything moves between, everything just basically moves on the pages. So one of the challenges of the ledgers is that one page doesn't give you all the information. We have what I call the folio reference pages, which are basically like an index. And it says, you read the line, and then it says, see this page for additional information. And so now you have to go to this page to get the rest of the story. Just for example, there is a chintz dress in the 1760 to 61 ledger. It is a very expensive dress, ladies. Chintz was like the premier cloth that you could get because it had a workaround because you weren't allowed to actually import chintz into England. And so the colonies become kind of like this go-between, intermediary for this fabric that is paid for by 3 or 4 different people for the production of this dress. I'm not entirely sure for whom the dress was intended, but they're like 3 or 4 different account holders that have a party to this dress. So you have to chase all these different pages to be able to put the story together. And I still haven't obviously still have not entirely put the story together. But that is part of the challenge of these pages, is that one doesn't do it. It's why we really are excited about being able to put this database together, because then when you pull up, you'll be able to see all the transactions that are related. Fingers crossed. Yes, ma'am. Okay, so the question is, do the ledgers detail the incoming goods? Yes. So we do not have, in essence, the invoice books for the most part. We have, well, I stand corrected. We have one invoice book, which documents all of the goods that were coming into the Hostone and Company store. I haven't figured out how to start tackling transcribing that yet, so that's just kind of lingering out there and waiting, because that's going to require a completely different template than the one I'm currently using. What the stores do, however, is, and in some ways we could kind of track it is if something came in a particular crate that had a specific number on it, sometimes you will see 25 hose, number 8. The number 8 isn't referring to the gauge of the hoe. The number 8 is referring to the container that is associated with an invoice book that is not extant. So, yes. What we also have, however, is like for Alexander Henderson, specifically for the Colchester store, Special Collections at the library down the street has Henderson's letter book, in which we have a goodly number of his orders to Glasgow. So when I described 450 hoes had been ordered, it's because we actually have Henderson's request for hose, or his request for all the goods that were ordered. Eventually, we hope to marry them back up with what is sold against what we know he ordered. But that is back to that being a long-term legacy project. I will have many more gray hairs before we get to that part, but I really hope we do. That's my end goal, is to be able to get to that. And that would be fascinating. It goes back to what Dr. Breen was attempting to do by comparing, she tried to compare Washington's orders and then his invoices when they came back and what Washington actually received. And so our hope is to be able to do something similar with the ledgers someday way down there. Yes, sir?
So, did the stores charge an interest or a premium on outstanding balances before they took it to court?
Okay, so the question is, did the stores charge interest? Rarely, believe it or not. We can see accounts carry over for years and no interest is bearing on them. After the Revolution, that changes a little bit. In fact, the final ledger associated with the Glassford accounts is actually from, I think it's 1802, in which basically it's them collecting debts. And at that point, they have started charging interest. And there is sometimes interest where you can see it, but it's not common. And it seems to sometimes be who you are and what it is. It's often not interest on purchases, it's interest on like bonds, or if you borrow money. That's where we sometimes see interest, but it's often very hard to discern what that interest is. And that is a level of economics that I have not yet gotten my head wrapped around. I see it and I can transcribe it, but I don't necessarily know what it means. So, yes, sir?
To the question about the incoming goods, have you established like a baseline from the shipping records, say like shipping records in 1773, but they're incredibly detailed for the 50s and the 60s, give you a good idea of what was coming into the Potomac. You can't pin it down to what town it was going.
So here's the trick. Because of another project I worked on behalf of Alexandria, the records coming into the Potomac are reasonably detailed, but most of the goods that we see coming into these stores are not coming into the Potomac. Most of these goods are coming into the Rappahannock or to the James, and they're moving by small craft. So they are a lot harder at that point to track. When you actually look at the Potomac customs records during this time, there's not nearly as many ships as you would think coming and going out of Alexandria as a custom-related port. You mostly see goods being exported, and the incoming goods often are just lumped together in cases where you just have one case of things. Yeah. Yeah, and so there's often no inventory, but nearest we can figure, or at least because when I was working on this other project, I had my how does this relate to my store ledgers? Very few of the ships coming in seem to be related to the stores that we have ledgers for. Most of them seem to be coming in for personal possessions, folks like George Washington who have made a massive order, and so it's his material goods that are coming in on those ships.
John Carlisle managed the Hudson and the Olive, so you see the Olive and Hudson coming out, probably coming in either the Octagon or Alexandria.
Maybe. That's part of the trick, though, is because I started trying to figure out what ports they were coming into, and it was never when I thought it was. Like, I tried to track some rum shipments that were coming in from the islands, and they ended up coming in, they are sold out of the store, and I think it's like late August is when I start to see the rum shipment starts to get sold out. They arrived into the port in Rappahannock in like early July, and so it took like 6 weeks for the rum to make its way from the port of Rappahannock all the way back up to here, because those small crafts are stopping at all these other small farms on the way up, dropping off goods, letters, that kind of thing, as it makes its way here into Alexandria.
Great. Thank you, Molly.
Of course. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll trade places with you.
Okay.
And I'll get my water, and I will turn that off.
You know, with the project of this length, Molly, do you see how, with your questions, I love the questions and the answers. You've absorbed so much, and you have this sense. I really think we need a happy hour with Molly to ask questions and just get what's in you and your sense of it. And so thanks for really good questions. Next month, April, I hope you'll come on the 26th, and we're going to have our annual awards for the T. Michael Miller Award, Special Award, people that have added so much to Alexandria history. And it's a time to celebrate them and also learn how much they have done, as well as students from all of the major high schools in Alexandria awards selected by their teachers. And our speaker for that night is Rob Newig, who is coming from the National Trust for Historic Preservation. He's a vice president, and he has created the Past Forward program to develop a nationwide collective direction for what is the preservation for this century, and what can we do now. And he's going to be sharing his thoughts, and this is great as we honor people that have done so much over decades in some cases for our awareness. Then on May 24th, and these are always the fourth Wednesday of the month, we have Susan Dillis coming to speak to us about a book that she's just published on the Jewish community of Northern Virginia. And this is 175 years of Jewish history in Northern Virginia. And her book has rarely seen photos, which she has collected from individuals. So I hope you'll come for that. And then on June 28th, the last of our spring season, we want to welcome Dr. Eleanor Breen, city archaeologist, giving us an update on the waterfront archaeology, which is continually brewing in front of us all the time. So I hope you can come for each of those. We will be posting on YouTube for the people who are willing to be recorded, and we hope we can get as many people as possible on the YouTube site afterwards. So please join us, and remember, then we will take a hiatus, but we probably will get some newsletters from us as well over the summer, and then we'll start again in September, October, and then boom, in January, we'll start celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Alexandria Historical Society. Some of us would like to be 50 again. Sounds youthful. But we want to be able to celebrate. So if you know people that were around 50 years ago, have thoughts about what was done and ideas of how you would like to recognize 50 years of studying and sharing history, please let us know. I think it can be a great year of awareness as we also move towards the 250th of the nation. And how many of the Alexandria? 275. Thank you. I knew you would know that. Thanks a lot, and happy month until I see you again.